Welcome to Philosophy of Value Workshops number 2 of Series 7. The question this evening is, are Hegel's and Sartre's concepts of being and nothingness relevant to practical philosophy? Reading from one of my works, The Pursuit of Value, Chapter 6, Section 10. Previously, in Series 5 and 6 of these workshops, I have presented topics systematically. Currently, in this Series 7, I am discussing topics as they present themselves in my research. So an overview of these studies is available by reviewing Series 6 on YouTube. One of my objectives is to discover how consciousness and its structures give rise and resolve problems of life. Today, I want to consider how the phenomenon of absence bears upon human life in this way. That is, how absence as a property of consciousness represents and resolves problems like loss and death. As a preliminary, we have previously discussed the difficulty of apprehending consciousness as self-consciousness. And I have also noted that apprehending the absence of consciousness is even more difficult. So apprehending the absence of consciousness may offer as much insight as its presence. Of interest here, the idea of zero is also a form of absence that had metaphysical implications for the ancients. Aristotelian thought believed that there was no void, and to accept zero questions the existence of God or the gods. So zero was forbidden in the West for 1500 years and was regarded as satanic by the Christian Church. We can briefly outline the history of this story, starting with Pythagoras. Pythagoras believed that reality is mathematical in character and there's no distinction between shape and number. And consistent with Plato's theory of forms, a number couldn't exist without a shape or form. For example, the number 4 forms a square and 3 forms a triangle, but 0 doesn't have a natural shape. So believing in 0 would upturn both Greek mathematics and metaphysics. The Greeks also believed that mathematics, reality and God were all intertwined. The 0 was associated with non-existence, oblivion and the denial of God. So this is one explanation of the omission of 0 as a kind of absence. But my interest is in the obfuscation and significance of another kind of absence, the absence of consciousness. And I previously argued for an error theory that shows how consciousness has been overlooked. And if consciousness has been overlooked and neglected, it's even more likely that the absence of consciousness has been overlooked and neglected. And the neglect of the absence of consciousness raises suspicion of other omissions. I have previously given phenomenological reasons why consciousness and its absence have been overlooked. But I want to start by noting a few ways in which the absence of consciousness has been overlooked. One is the religious understanding of consciousness as spirit or soul projected outside the human world. Another is an inability or unwillingness to accept death as an absence of an individual existence. A third is an over-eagerness to attribute consciousness to AI computers where none exists. Yet my real topic of investigation is not such neglect of absence, but absence as a property of consciousness. But I have noted that both consciousness and its absence are difficult to examine directly. So I will start by discussing absences of capacities of consciousness rather than consciousness itself. And there are numerous concepts and capacities which can be used to illustrate the absence of consciousness. First, we will later be able to use the idea of freedom to represent a positive aspect of nothingness. There is also the absence of undesirable aspects of consciousness like revenge, moralism, or the Buddhist non-self. And there's the absence of consciousness as a haunting, ever-present accompaniment to consciousness. Yet I want to show how absence is inherent to structures of consciousness that are revealed in unexpected ways. For example, further to the Greek rejection of zero, I have argued elsewhere that number is a product of the fundamental differentiation within consciousness. I did this to show how even number can be explained with structures of consciousness. Similarly, Anthony Grayling points to Merleau-Ponty's interest in the absence of past and future from the present. This view becomes relevant with Husserl's and Heidegger's notion of time as the horizon of being. Then the absence of past and future is no longer a trivial fact, but is seen as a structure of consciousness. And this is a model for the analysis of absence as a property of consciousness, that the trivial becomes significant given another perspective. Yet my objective here is also to show how absence as an aspect of consciousness can be applied in a practical way. That is, how a reinterpretation of absence can become a positive factor in confronting human finitude and death. And in this project, I see philosophical ideas as clues to understanding rather than theories that are true or false. That is, I see philosophy as a kind of mythology, not as fiction, but as distorted or incomplete insight. The history of philosophy and science is replete with mistaken ideas that were later improved upon. And such a view is tacitly endorsed by Whitehead, Karl Popper and Heidegger. For example, Whitehead reminds us that no metaphysic is definitive and that every philosophy will suffer a deposition. Karl Popper gives us the falsifiability criterion that genuine science must be falsifiable. Heidegger tells us that all description and definition is ultimately metaphorical. And Hegel and Sartre are no less subject to such appraisal. Sartre, for example, defines value as lack or absence of what we do not have. But this account doesn't accord with positive instances of value like compassion, love and magnanimity. Yet, as we will see, Sartre's account does accord with the ideas of possibility and freedom. And Sartre's view that value can simultaneously be and not be indicates the ambiguity of value. And these negative elements also express a tension which produces value. Developments of ideas about absences are, as noted earlier, particularly prominent in religion. These are not only religious denials of death, but Buddhist notions of the not-self and forms of self-abnegation. And in a modern moral perspective, there is a desirability of the absence or clearing away of some of these states. These not only include misleading and mistaken ideas, but also egoistic conceptions of oneself or excessively self-deprecating ideas of oneself. Then there are other undesirable states like guilt, hatred, vindictiveness, cowardness, and others. First in my own list of desirable absences is an excessive dependence on a supporting cognitive framework. That is, I argue for a certain maturity or sufficiency of value that is less dependent on cognitive frameworks. That is, excessive cognitive support is undesirable, and an absence would be preferable. One of the most significant expressions of cognitive support is evident in our relations with other people. That is, we suffer from a huge, both recognised and unrecognised need of social endorsement. Social endorsement affects our self-esteem, self-concept, and affects us in many other ways. In my view, the replacement of social esteem by self-esteem and sufficient value would have radical social and personal effects. That is, we would all live our lives for the better in different ways with different objectives. A more stark instance of absence is that of death, as an absence of life, consciousness, and a future. I previously noted that Viktor Frankl and Heidegger regard death as a prerequisite of meaning. Sartre criticises this view because death is a contingent event, so it can't be essential to meaning. I agree, and thereby look to the idea of absence as non-being within consciousness. Usefully for us, Hegel and Sartre regard non-being, nothingness or absence as an essential aspect of existence. Yet their understanding of nothingness is different. Sartre regards nothingness as an aspect of consciousness. Hegel's view is cosmological. For Hegel, both being and nothingness are enigmas that nevertheless apply across the whole spectrum of existence. In one sense, they form a dialectic, commonly thought of in terms of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. But Hegel talks of differentiating concepts and setting them up in opposition to be resolved by reason. In another Hegelian sense, being is indeterminate, and any attempt to grasp it transforms into the idea of nothingness. This happens because one side of the dialectic becomes unstable and turns into its opposite. Yet for Hegel, this has significant consequences, such as producing the phenomenon of becoming. And this leads Hegel to a trinity of being, a trinity of being, nothingness, and becoming, exemplifying his dialectic. But Hegel's philosophical position has been criticised as highly speculative or even contradictory. His view of the absolute spirit working itself out through the world is often rejected as theological. Even Kierkegaard thought that Hegel's philosophy could only be accepted as a speculative hypothesis. Yet it's in this spirit that we can consider Hegel as offering a broad introductory idea about being and becoming. Applied to humanity, his idea is that clinging to life will lose it, and a readiness to lose life will gain it. This is, of course, a religious idea, expressed in G.K. Chesterton's words that a soldier must seek his life in a spirit of furious indifference to it. This isn't a metaphysical principle, but an example of how such might be applied. Yet one of the ways that Hegel sees the absolute spirit working itself out in the world is in increasing freedoms. This begins historically with the special freedom of kings and rulers, then for the elite, and then finally for everyone. And for Hegel, freedom had its own necessities that are expressed in rights. Although Sartre's thought is often regarded as difficult, it's more approachable than either Heidegger or Hegel. This is because Sartre is primarily concerned with consciousness rather than the even more abstruse notion of being. Yet Sartre describes consciousness as being for itself, which has distinctive relations with physical being in itself. On this definition, physicality has impregnable being which cannot be deformed, reduced or threatened. Yet he sees a contingent and ephemeral consciousness seeking the permanent in itself of physicality. But this project is impossible, hence Sartre describes mankind as a useless passion. It is an example of philosophy as a kind of mythology or incomplete insight. For this and other reasons, I replace the permanence of physicality with an achievable sufficiency of value. But the point here is that for Sartre, the relation between the for itself and the in itself produces an internal negation. And this means that consciousness brings non-being, nothingness and absence into existence. Hence the title of Sartre's major work, Being and Nothingness. More than that, for Sartre, consciousness brings freedom as well as nothingness into existence. This is because choice and freedom come into the world with consciousness as constituents of my existence. And Sartre says that under these conditions, freedom can be nothing other than this nihilation. That is, for Sartre, consciousness, nothingness, choice and freedom are inseparable, yet we are condemned to be free. And it's in this sense that nothingness is not only compatible with freedom, but gives it space to exist. It is the nothingness of absence that provide the possibilities which enable the exercise of freedom. In this way, nothingness, non-being or absence in consciousness can be seen positively as a condition of freedom. But Sartre's relation between the for itself and the in itself seems to be contingent upon theoretical agreement. That is, as above, that relation need not be accepted as such by ourselves as conscious participants. His arguments also stretch credulity, like his idea of absolute freedom or free will. In clarification, Epicurus' theory of atoms can help to illustrate how space or absence makes room for free will. Epicurus held that we can observe that there are bodies and that there must be a void to allow for motion. So everything is in a process of change, but nothing can come from nothing or disappear entirely. Therefore there must be a tiny indivisible bodies that don't change, and these are called atoms, which are the smallest part of something. Democritus, though, concluded from this that everything is determined, including human will. Epicurus disagrees because we can see that we do have free will. So Epicurus introduces the idea of the swerve, that atoms can have a small degree of indeterminacy. Some people think that the swerve anticipates the indeterminacy of quantum theory. Yet for us, indeterminacy is a kind of absence that gives freedom its space to exist. Yet returning to Sartre, there's another interpretation of his notion of nothingness that's more credible. That is, consciousness is about what isn't apparent, as well as about external reality. And understanding something as present involves an appreciation that other things are absent. Therefore, those absences are always part of my consciousness of the world. Prior to Sartre, Husserl's phenomenology was initially a pre-reflective description of the world. But Husserl's concept of the life world recognized an embedded world of meanings and prejudgments. That is, when we perceive a house, we understand that there is a back of the house that we don't see. And the back of the house is absent from our perception, but it is part of our consciousness of the house. In this way, absences are always part of our consciousness of our world. Sartre gives us a number of narratives about what this might mean, such as when he doesn't find Pierre in the cafe. And Slavoj Zizek makes the same point in his joke about having coffee with no cream or no milk. The point is that there are different kinds of absences, and these absences are significant. This interpretation of Sartre anticipates the postmodern account of absence, but in the sense of epistemic meaning. Derrida claims meanings are both historical and structural, relating to immediate meanings in language. He describes historic meanings obscurely as diachronic and structural meanings as synchronic. This means that meanings really refer to all other references which are absent. But this cannot be done, so the full meaning of anything can't be fully anticipated. So on this view, epistemic meaning implies absence. But I'm sceptical whether the postmodern theory of meaning as an absence of meaning takes us very far. Standard critiques of language and Wittgenstein's complex theory also reject complete meanings. Moreover, postmodernism denies an ontology of consciousness together with non-being. So both Hegel's and Sartre's accounts of the absence of consciousness are subject to contention. Yet in different ways, both Hegel and Sartre regard nothingness as producing freedom. In Hegel, being, non-being and becoming are coexistent, producing freedom and, paradoxically, obligations and rights. For Sartre, consciousness, nothingness, choice and freedom are coexistent, also paradoxically producing the constraint that we are condemned to be free. Yet the idea of nothingness as a positive aspect of consciousness producing freedom can be viewed another way. That is by distinguishing the classic meaning of freedom to act from the meaning freedom from things, usually defined as freedom from pain, hunger, poverty, injustice, thirst, etc. Given the meaning of freedom from certain things, we can go back and list some of the previously noted features, such as freedom from excessive cognitive support, moralistic judgments, bad faith, and moral realism. These are aspects or products of consciousness that we might be better off without. In this way, these absences or states of consciousness can be seen as positive. But we are still a long way from resolving human finitude, loss and death by reference to consciousness and non-being. Hegel's and Sartre's accounts of freedom and non-being are too abstruse to be practical, and Schopenhauer's answer that it's better not to exist is unjustifiably pessimistic and negative. But an appreciation of both consciousness and its absence brings a new appreciation of its various forms of absence. That is, human finitude, loss and death need no longer be regarded as aberrations to be viewed with horror. They are now essential parts of the physical world, consciousness and the possibility of its non-existence. This is, I think, a more realistic view of either Hegel's or Sartre's notions of non-being and nothingness. For example, for Sartre, the relation for consciousness with being, with physical being in itself, brings nothingness into existence. And he writes that nothingness lies coiled in the heart of being like a worm. In this view, absence is a malign element threatening consciousness with negation. Yet more credibly, the absence that consciousness brings into existence can be observed in more mundane ways. To begin with, a distinction between self and non-self is essential for the survival of all conscious creatures. And for self-conscious creatures, the non-self includes everything that I am aware of. The non-self, or absence, includes the infinite expanses of the world. It includes everything that I'm not, everything that I don't know, as well as the possibility of non-existence. And there is so much we are not conscious of and never will be conscious of. Yet, like the presence of consciousness, this absence is hugely overlooked. And this absence will not be appreciated without an appreciation of consciousness. But this view has little significance as an academic theory without an awareness of consciousness and its absence. Moreover, human finitude, loss and death still remain as painful experiences in our lives. To mitigate these, I previously offered a theory of meaning, death and sufficient value, and the above account offers a view of loss and death as universal conditions of consciousness. Yet again, grasping the absence of consciousness involves the problem of apprehending consciousness. And one of the difficulties is that the above account of the absence of consciousness has been ostensive. That is, both consciousness and its absence have been defined by numerous particular examples. This is because the concept of consciousness is, in one sense, a fabrication. There is no pure consciousness. The general concept of consciousness is a collective of cognitive, affect volitional and value states. And it can only be defined with numerous properties like intentionality and phenomenality. Even personal experience and personal identity are only parts of the whole. Similarly, the significance of the absence of consciousness might only be grasped through its various expressions. For example, freedom, life world, nothingness, meaning, non-self, moral refrain, or a conceptual clearing out. Yet, like consciousness, the significance of the absence of consciousness can also be grasped as a synthetic unity. That is, the capacity of consciousness to synthesize all these things into one view. Such a perspective has already been described by Heidegger and others as the uncanny, or the mysterious. Freud similarly described mysticism as having a sense of oneness with the universe. Bertrand Russell described the mystical outlook as one of the interrelatedness of things. Wittgenstein talked about mysteriousness as feeling the world as a limited whole. Wittgenstein said that there are things that cannot be put into the world, into words. They are what is mystical. But there's another interpretation, that they are mystical because they can't be described in the wholeness, rather than being a mystery that can't be described. So how do these esoteric aspects of the absence of consciousness help us with practical problems of life? The primary expression of an absence of consciousness is, of course, death and loss. But the fact that this problem is reflected in the structures of consciousness might give us little comfort. Yet to begin with, having an understanding of absence enables us to construct another conception of loss and death. That is, I previously argued that a sufficiency of value can resolve the problem of death as an absent future. And the concepts of freedom, absence and possibility make way for that, for the possibility of value to come into the world. And sufficiency of value is also not just a quantification or maximization of value, but is a mode of value qualified by ambiguity, otherness and absence. In conclusion, we can review how absence as a property of consciousness might resolve problems like death. Yet I should reiterate that this is part of a project to explain problems in terms of consciousness. So we first looked at how Hegel's and Sartre's notions of being and nothingness led to the idea of freedom. But these seemed too abstruse to be credible and too limited to resolve problems of life. Various other semantic interpretations of absence also seemed of limited significance. Yet the absence of other aspects of consciousness were more susceptible to positive interpretations. These were not only freedoms from states like poverty, pain and injustice, but also from states like excessive cognitive support and moralistic judgments. But a general application of nothingness and absence as aspects of solution needed a more general perspective, and a more general perspective was proposed as an appreciation of both consciousness and its absence. That is, a new appreciation of the absence of consciousness was proposed as a way of looking at human finitude. That is, human finitude, loss and death aren't just contingent events in life, they are part of the structure and reality of consciousness. And in turn, consciousness is part of the structure and reality of the world. That is, a new appreciation of consciousness gives rise to a new appreciation of the absence of consciousness. That is, the different ways that consciousness is absent reveal how its various expressions can be present. This is illustrated in the key concept of value sufficiency, particularly in confronting death. That is, value sufficiency isn't a maximization, again, but a quality that must also entail absence. So next week we'll be looking at the question of how, or whether and how information is an aspect of consciousness. So let me have your criticisms and comments on websites like meetup.com, philosophy of value workshops.